Stardate 7/31/2186. This is the captain of the SES Sentinel of the Stars. We have an ongoing mission to patrol the Andromeda sector, which placed us on the front lines of the Galactic War as the fight has come to several planets in the sector over the past few weeks. There is currently a 200,000 bot kill order on Charon Prime. We sent the Defender down to the surface to scout for a LIDAR station. While he was unsuccessful, he did manage to fulfill some mission objectives before evac. I've decided to brief our Helldiver on the next upload, should he find the LIDAR station on his next drop. Welcome aboard, Helldiver. How is the surface?
It was fine, Captain. Too bad we couldn't find a spot to upload.
That's okay. Let's get you up to speed. What do you remember from our last upload?
Captain, wasn't here then.
It's okay, Defender. Last time we uploaded data, we discussed establishing the Continental Army as the 13 colonies entered the American Revolution. We also talked about the early stages of the Continental Congress.
Yes, that's what my HUD is saying.
Great. Are you ready for some new information?
Yes, Captain. I'm ready when you are. What are we covering in this mission?
Well, we can go in a few directions. Did you have a question about the data we've shared so far?
Actually, Captain, I have two questions. How did the Continental Congress hold the fledgling country together during the Revolution? And how did Congress as we know it come out of the Revolution?
That's an excellent question, Defender. This era is fascinating because the body that started the American Revolution was wildly different from the legislature that emerged at the end of it. To understand how Congress evolved, we have to look at the immense pressure of the war, the failure of our first government, and the grand compromise that birthed the modern system.
Holding the line. The Continental Congress. During the Revolution, the Continental Congress was less a true national government and more of an emergency council of ambassadors from 13 sovereign states. They operated without a formal constitution until 1781, and they completely lacked the power of the purse. They could not levy taxes. So how did they hold the country together and win a war against the British Empire? Through a mix of diplomacy, debt, and sheer persistence. Unable to tax, Congress printed its own fiat currency, the Continental. It rapidly became worthless, spawning the phrase, "not worth a Continental." But it kept the army afloat in the early years. Later, they relied on massive loans negotiated with France and the Netherlands. Congress appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Despite massive frustrations, supply shortages, and near mutinies, Congress maintained civilian oversight of the military, a vital precedent for the new republic. Congress's greatest wartime achievement wasn't on the battlefield. It was sending diplomats like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams to Europe. Securing the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1778 provided the money, naval power, and troops that actually won the war. For context, the Second Continental Congress famously drafted the Declaration of Independence, acting as a de facto government for the colonies during the war's most critical years. The breaking point, the Articles of Confederation. After the war, the country officially operated under the Articles of Confederation. Under this system, Congress was a unicameral, one-house body where each state, regardless of size, had exactly one vote. It was an utter disaster for a growing nation because Congress couldn't tax. It couldn't pay off its massive war debts. Because they couldn't regulate commerce, states started engaging in trade wars with one another. When Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising of debt-ridden farmers, broke out in Massachusetts in 1786, the national government was entirely powerless to raise an army to stop it. The founders realized the system couldn't be patched, so it had to be completely rewritten. Forging the modern Congress. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Their biggest hurdle in designing a new Congress was the bitter fight over representation. the Virginia Plan, large states argued that representation should be based on population. Why should a massive state have the same voting power as tiny Rhode Island? The New Jersey Plan, small states demanded equal representation. If it was based on population, they feared the large states would completely dominate the national agenda. The convention nearly collapsed over this issue until Roger Sherman proposed the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, which created the bicameral two-chamber Congress you know of today. The House of Representatives, apportioned by population, satisfying the large states and serving as the people's house. Initially, only the House was directly elected by the public. The Senate, 2 senators per state, regardless of population, satisfying the small states and acting as a more deliberate, stabilizing chamber. By tying these 2 chambers together and finally granting Congress the powers to tax, regulate interstate commerce, and raise an army, the founders transformed Congress from a weak diplomatic assembly into a supreme national legislature.
You mentioned that Congress created its own fiat currency, the Continental. How or why did it rapidly become worthless?
It was a textbook case of hyperinflation, driven by a perfect storm of economic desperation and a fundamental lack of political power. The core issue was that the Continental was a true fiat currency, meaning it wasn't backed by physical gold or silver in a vault. Its value rested entirely on the anticipation of future tax revenues. But as we just covered, the Continental Congress didn't actually have the power to collect taxes. They had to ask the states for money, and the states rarely paid up. Here is exactly how the system collapsed so quickly.
War is incredibly expensive. Without tax revenue or enough foreign loans early on, Congress's only way to pay soldiers and buy supplies was to print more Continentals. In 1775, Congress authorized 2 million in bills. By 1779, there were over 240 million in circulation. When you flood the market with currency, the value of each individual bill plummets. To make matters worse, the 13 individual states were printing their own fiat currencies to fund their local militias. The sheer volume of competing, unbacked paper money circulating in the colonies completely saturated the economy. The British recognized the fragility of the American economy and actively exploited it. They printed massive amounts of counterfeit Continentals, often of higher quality than the real ones, and smuggled them across British lines into the colonies. This accelerated the hyperinflation and completely shattered public trust in the money. A fiat currency only works if people believe it has value. As the war drug on, defeats piled up, and Congress proved unable to secure a stable income. The public lost faith that the new government would survive, let alone redeem the bills. By 1781, the currency had completely collapsed. A good that cost $1 in 1775 cost over 160 in Continentals by 1780, leading to the popular phrase, "not worth the Continental."
How did the United States finally stabilize its currency and economy after the Continental collapsed?
It took a completely new constitution and a financial genius to pull the new nation out of economic ruin. The stabilization of the U.S. economy didn't happen overnight, but it was largely engineered by the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He understood that a nation without good credit or a stable currency could not survive. Here is how the U.S. stopped the economic bleeding and established a system that worked.
The absolute prerequisite of fixing the economy was the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. The Constitution directly targeted the economic failures of the Articles of Confederation. The power to tax. It granted the federal government the authority to levy taxes and tariffs directly, providing a reliable revenue stream to pay off debts. It strictly forbade individual states from coining their own money, issuing paper bills of credit, or making anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. This immediately stopped the chaos of 13 competing worthless state currencies. Hamilton's three-part plan. With the legal framework in place, Hamilton proposed a radical, highly controversial financial plan to establish the nation's credit. Hamilton convinced Congress that the federal government should take over all the unpaid war debts accumulated by the individual states, combining them into one massive national debt. By issuing new federal bonds to pay for this, he tied the financial interests of the country's wealthiest citizens to the success of the new federal government. He pushed for the creation of the first Bank of the United States. Modeled on the Bank of England, it would act as the government's fiscal agent, collecting tax revenues, securing funds, and making loans to both the government and private businesses to stimulate economic growth. To pay the interest on this newly consolidated national debt, Hamilton established a system of tariffs on imported goods and an excise tax on domestic whiskey, which famously led to the Whiskey Rebellion. Finally, to restore absolute confidence in the currency itself, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1792. This act established the U.S. Mint and officially tied the U.S. dollar to a bimetallic standard, meaning that the dollar was legally defined as a specific physical weight of either silver or gold. By abandoning unbacked paper, fiat money, and returning to hard currency, the government ensured that a dollar had intrinsic value that couldn't be inflated away by a printing press.
What would have happened to the fledgling country if Hamilton had failed?
If Hamilton's financial plan had been defeated, which almost happened as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought it bitterly, most historians agree the United States would have fractured, defaulted, and likely been carved up by European powers. Without his system to bind the country together economically, the cascading failures would have looked something like this.
Complete default and loss of foreign support. By 1790, the United States owed massive sums to French and Dutch bankers and to its own citizens. If Hamilton had failed to consolidate that debt and establish federal taxes to pay it off, the U.S. would have defaulted. No foreign nation would have lent money to the United States ever again. When the War of 1812 breaks out a few decades later, the country would have had zero credit to fund an army or navy, leaving it practically defenseless against British reconquest. Under Hamilton's plan, the federal government absorbed all state debts. If that had failed, the states would have been left to fend for themselves, creating toxic regional divides. Heavily indebted northern states like Massachusetts would have been forced to levy crushing taxes on their own citizens, likely sparking more violent uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. Meanwhile, wealthy, debt-free states like Virginia would have thrived. This economic disparity would have bred intense resentment. Instead of operating as a single unified market, states would have likely erected tariffs against each other, essentially engaging in trade wars until the fragile union shattered into 2 or 3 regional confederacies. The agrarian ceiling. Hamilton's vision for the Bank of the United States wasn't just about paying debts. It was about creating capital. The bank provided the credit necessary to build factories, fund shipping fleets, and build infrastructure. If the bank hadn't been established, the U.S. economy would have lacked the liquidity to industrialize. It would have remained the agrarian utopia Thomas Jefferson dreamed of, a nation of independent farmers. While politically romantic, an entire agrarian America would have remained permanently dependent on Britain and France for manufactured goods, weapons, and textiles, keeping the U.S. as a de facto economic colony long after winning political independence. By tying the wallets of the wealthy directly to the survival of the federal government, Hamilton made sure it was too expensive to let the United States fail.
You mentioned that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought against Hamilton's plan. Do they have a different idea? What was their plan?
They absolutely did. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison didn't just disagree with Hamilton on the math. They believed Hamilton's plan would destroy the very soul of the new republic. While Hamilton envisioned a bustling, industrialized powerhouse driven by banks, factories, and federal supremacy, Jefferson and Madison wanted something completely different.
Jefferson's vision for the United States was rooted in agriculture. He believed the ideal citizen was the yeoman farmer, an independent, self-sufficient landowner who wasn't beholden to a boss, a banker, or a powerful government. To Jefferson, cities were breeding grounds of corruption, inequality, and mobs. He looked at the slums and smoking factories of Europe and wanted no part of it. He believed that as long as America had vast expanses of land, its citizens could remain free, virtuous farmers while trading their raw agricultural goods to Europe in exchange for manufactured items. The constitutional argument. When Hamilton proposed the first Bank of the United States, Jefferson and Madison attacked it on constitutional grounds. They argued for strict constructionism, the belief that the federal government can only do exactly what is written in the Constitution. They scoured the document and pointed out that nowhere did it grant Congress the power to create a national bank. Hamilton countered with implied powers, pointing to the necessary and proper clause, arguing that if the government had the power to tax and regulate trade, it naturally had the power to create a bank to manage those funds. Jefferson feared this logic would give the federal government unlimited power. The most immediate, bitter fight was over Hamilton's plan to absorb all of the states' war debts into one massive federal debt. Madison and Jefferson hated this for two reasons. Many southern states, like Virginia, had already paid off the majority of their war debts through heavy taxation. They were furious at the idea of being taxed again by the federal government to bail out northern states like Massachusetts that had been financially irresponsible. During the war, desperate soldiers had been paid in government IOUs. When times got tough, many sold those IOUs for pennies on the dollar to wealthy northern speculators. Hamilton's plan promised to pay these IOUs back at full face value, meaning the rich speculators would make a fortune off the sacrifices of the veterans. The Fighting Gridlock Congress. Hamilton's debt plan was repeatedly voted down, and the Union was genuinely on the verge of splintering over the money. The crisis was finally resolved in June 1790, supposedly over a private dinner hosted by Jefferson with Madison and Hamilton in attendance. They struck one of the most famous deals in American history, known as the Compromise of 1790. Madison agreed to stop blocking the debt assumption plan in Congress, allowing Hamilton to establish the national debt and the bank. In exchange, Hamilton agreed to use his influence to move the permanent capital of the United States out of the financial hubs of the North, like New York and Philadelphia, and relocate it to a swampy stretch of land along the Potomac River in the South, which would one day become Washington, D.C. By moving the capital, Southerners felt they could keep a closer eye on the federal government and prevent it from being entirely captured by Northern bankers.
Did this pave the way for a version of Congress that America would be known for?
Yes. The Hamilton-Jefferson feud birthed the defining feature of the American legislative branch, the two-party system. The founders originally despised the idea of political parties, which they called factions. George Washington famously used his farewell address to warn the country that political parties would inevitably tear the young nation apart. But the economic and constitutional disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson were so profound that they forced every lawmaker to take a side.
The dinner table compromises didn't last long, however. By the mid-1790s, the factions in Congress had hardened into the first organized political parties. You had the Federalists, led by Hamilton and later John Adams. They favored a powerful central government, a national banking system, and a strong standing military, and a modernized industrial economy. And then you had the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. They championed states' rights, strict adherence to the Constitution, an agrarian economy, and a smaller, less intrusive federal government. Originally, Congress was envisioned as a deliberative body where independent, high-minded gentlemen would debate the merits of an issue and naturally reach a consensus. The Hamilton-Jefferson split destroyed that ideal almost immediately. Members of Congress began voting in organized, predictable blocks. They started holding private meetings, caucuses, to align their votes before bills even reached the floor. Partisan newspapers sprung up, acting as aggressive mouthpieces for either the Federalists or the Republicans, and viciously attacked lawmakers on the other side. The tension became so intense that it literally erupted into physical violence on the House floor. Because of this fundamental divide, Congress had to invent rules and structures to maintain partisan warfare. Almost every defining feature of the modern Congress traces its roots back to lawmakers organizing themselves to fight these early ideological battles. The center aisle. The physical seating arrangement of Congress, with opposing parties literally divided by a center aisle, became permanent as factions solidified. The need to coordinate strategy led to the creation of formal majority and minority leaders whose entire job is to whip their members into voting along party lines. Parties realized that the best way to maintain power was to control the committees, allowing the majority party to kill opposing legislation before it even got debated.
Was there a name or historical reference to this post-revolution, pre-congressional era?
Yes. Historians almost universally refer to the years between the end of the Revolutionary War, 1783, and the inauguration of George Washington under the new Constitution, 1789, as the critical period. It is also broadly known as the Confederation era. The term critical period was coined by John Quincy Adams, but it was truly popularized by the historian John Fiske in his 1888 book, The Critical Period of American History. The name fits perfectly because the nation was entirely experimental, and its survival was in serious doubt. Having defeated the British, the existential threat keeping the 13 states unified was gone. During this brief but chaotic 6-year window, the country had to navigate 3 massive hurdles without a functioning national government.
As we discussed with the Continental, the nation was drowning in war debt. Congress couldn't tax, so it couldn't pay its soldiers for its foreign allies. The states started printing their own money and aggressively taxing each other's goods, sparking vicious trade wars. Britain and Spain looked at the weak, divided states and saw an easy target. Britain refused to abandon its forts in the Great Lakes, violating a peace treaty, and Spain closed the port of New Orleans to American farmers, choking off Western trade. The tipping point came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion, when heavily taxed farmers in Massachusetts took up arms and marched on a federal armory. The Confederation Congress realized it didn't have the power or funds to raise an army to stop them. Massachusetts had to hire a private militia. It was this very real fear of anarchy and collapse during the critical period that convinced leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison that a much stronger centralized government, Congress, was the only way to save the republic that they had just fought for.
As we approach the end of the 1700s and move into the 1800s, is there anything that we need to include in order for our research to be the most thorough?
To make your research on this transition era truly thorough, you need to look at how the theoretical rules of the Constitution were actually tested in practice. The late 1790s and early 1800s were when the system endured its first real stress tests. If you are closing out the 18th century and moving into the 19th, your deep dive must include these 4 pivotal moments that permanently altered how Congress operates.
The election of 1800 is arguably the most important election in American history because it was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties, but it almost broke Congress in the process. Because of a flaw in how the Electoral College originally worked, Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tied electoral votes. Under the Constitution, a time-limited decision went to the House of Representatives. For 35 agonizing ballots, the lame duck Federalist Congress refused to pick a winner, pushing the country to the brink of civil war before Alexander Hamilton finally intervened to sway the vote to Jefferson. This near disaster forced Congress to draft and pass the 12th Amendment in 1803, which separated electoral votes for president and vice president, permanently altering how the executive branch is chosen and averting future ties of this nature. During the quasi-war with France, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed laws making it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. They used it to jail Republican newspaper editors and even a sitting member of Congress, Matthew Lyon. This was the first major legislative test of the First Amendment. It sparked massive backlash and led Jefferson and Madison to secretly draft the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which argued that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws, a dangerous precedent that would eventually lay the ideological groundwork for the Civil War. Marbury versus Madison and the check on Congress. Before leaving office in 1801, John Adams and the Federalist Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, packing the courts with Federalist judges, the midnight judges, to maintain power. When Jefferson took over, his administration refused to deliver some of the commissions. This led to the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. Why it matters for Congress. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that a section of the Judiciary Act passed by Congress was unconstitutional. This established the principle of judicial review. The Supreme Court's power to strike down laws passed by Congress. It cemented the judicial branch as a co-equal check on legislative power. The legislation of slavery and expansion. As the 1800s dawned, Congress began wrestling with the issue that would eventually tear the country apart. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, had explicitly forbidden Congress from banning the importation of enslaved people for 20 years. As that 1808 deadline approached, Congress had to act. They passed the Act prohibiting importation of slaves, which took effect on January 1st, 1808. While it ended the international slave trade, it did nothing to stop the domestic slave trade. From this point forward, every time Congress admitted a new state to the expanding Union, they faced a bitter legislative battle over whether it would be a free state or a slave state.
Captain, I highly recommend that we end this briefing here, and in our next update, we will dedicate that time to exploring Congress's relationship with slavery.
That does sound like a plan. Okay, Defender, the next drop site is set. Let's see if we can find the LIDAR station. Thank you for checking out another installment of my ongoing series. Until next week, this has been your captain. For Super Earth, for real Earth, for all of us.
Engaging orbital push initiated.
Children are in your hands. Do not let them fall.
Objective located.
Deploying sentry. Units removed.